Presidents and civil liberties. How have our presidents done in terms of protecting civil liberties and advancing the rights of American citizens? Hello, I'm Sam Walker, author of the book, Presidents and Civil Liberties, From Wilson to Obama. How have our presidents done in terms of civil liberties? Well, the truth is they have a very poor record. Some of our best presidents have been responsible for some of the worst violations of civil liberties in our history. And very rarely have presidents stepped forward in times of national crisis to protect our civil liberties. Let's look at some of the highlights, or perhaps the lowlights, of this history. World War I. President Woodrow Wilson was guilty of the most massive suppression of freedom of speech and press in American history. When the U.S. went to war in April of 1917, there was almost complete suppression of dissent and opposition to the war. The major anti-war spokespersons, Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist, and Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, were both prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Emma Goldman was deported to the Soviet Union. Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Complaints about the suppression of civil liberties reached Woodrow Wilson's desks, and he turned them all aside. So he was personally responsible for this terrible event in American history. World War II, even worse. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order that authorized the evacuation of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So 120,000 people, 90,000 of whom were bona fide American citizens, were detained in what they called relocation centers and what we prefer to call concentration camps. Again, Roosevelt was personally responsible for this by virtue of the executive order that made it happen. And most historians regard this as perhaps the worst violation of civil liberties in American history. Later, Richard Nixon was guilty of just sweeping abuses of presidential power. People associated with his administration perpetrated the famous Watergate break-in in June of 1972. And in the Oval Office, Nixon himself engineered a cover-up that amounted to obstruction of justice. And that was responsible for his resignation as president in August of 1974. In addition, the administration had an enemies list of people who were critics and who were targeted for retaliation by the IRS and other federal agencies. Nixon is the only American president who ever resigned from office, and he resigned in disgrace. More recently, President George W. Bush was responsible for perhaps the most sweeping violations of civil liberties across the board of any American president. He made extraordinary claims of presidential power. He asserted that when he acted as commander-in-chief, his actions could not be reviewed by Congress or the federal courts. Now, fortunately, the Supreme Court rejected that argument. And his abuses of power included what are referred to as the CIA's harsh interrogation techniques. Most people around the world regard it as torture, and it really brought shame to this country. In addition, there was massive secrecy on the part of the administration and illegal spying by the National Security Agency. Now, you may have noticed that of the four presidents I mentioned, 2 are Democrats, 2 are Republicans. And so it seems that both parties in times of national crisis have been guilty of violating civil liberties. Now, is there any good news in this story? Well, there is some. Some presidents actually have taken some positive action. Harry Truman was really the first civil rights president. He appointed the first presidential commission on civil rights in 1946, and delivered a report in 1947 which really charted a course for the civil rights activity. Lyndon Johnson was probably the greatest civil liberties president. He really put all of his effort into passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then a year later the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Those are 2 of the most important laws in our history. In addition, Johnson did many things in terms of the rights of the elderly and the rights of the disabled. And he's also alone in being the only president in our history who ever spoke out in terms of the constitutional rights of criminal suspects and prisoners. Again, he's really alone in that regard. Finally, Johnson was the first family planning and birth control president. He initiated federal support for family planning services, and very important part of his record. Of course, Truman had some very bad civil liberties aspects on his record with the federal loyalty program. And Johnson, of course, with the Vietnam War, which was a tragedy for the nation and it really brought down his presidency. So even their records are fairly mixed. So in the end, taking a broad view, American presidents have a very poor record on civil liberties, and with only a few bright spots here and there. I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of some of these presidents and these issues in some other talks. Thank you.